Hi, my name is Autumn Dixon, and this week is March 21st through the 27th, and we are going to be in Exodus. If you want to receive your Come Follow Me lesson in a different format, I post my podcast and my blog in the description below the video. So, for this week, we see the beginning of Moses before he's a prophet. We see how he was placed in a river by his mother, how he was found by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in Egypt. But before I want to get into the Israelites moving on from Egypt, I actually want to talk about the Israelites as a people. The concept of this idea that they're this community, that they're their own separate race, and they have their own culture, they have their own system of government, right? When we picture the Israelites as a people, we picture this group of people that was enslaved in Egypt, moved throughout the wilderness for a while until they eventually settled into the promised land. They are a theocracy led by men who were led by God. They have their own culture, their way of doing things, right? They are a people, they are a race. But it wasn't always that way. They weren't always this big group of people that was being led, right? They didn't have this organized, formal church structure. It began with just Abraham. Abraham was not raised in a gospel-centered home, right? His father tried to sacrifice him. Everything that he knew about God, he learned directly from God, right? He didn't have leaders teaching him the gospel. He learned it directly from God. And it was the same way for his son. I want you to imagine being the child of Abraham, right? Your father comes to you and he was like, okay, I have spoken to God, and this is how it is. This is how the earth came to be. There's going to be a man named Jesus Christ. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? You don't have young men's leaders, young women's leaders. There's no bishops, stake presidents. There's no organized 2-hour blocks on Sundays, right? We don't have this organized church. Everything that you knew about God, you learned in your small family unit. And as far as you know, there's nobody else in the world who believes like you do. And not only was it just starting out, this gospel just starting out with this one little family, they were also living in a dangerous place, right? They were nomads, right? There were territory wars over water and limited resources for flocks. It was a dangerous place until one day, posterity down the line from Abraham, there is a boy named Joseph who's 17 years old. He's sold into slavery, and through a series of both unfortunate and fortunate events, he rises to power in Egypt, becomes the right-hand man to Pharaoh, and not only does he save Egypt from a famine, but he brings in this family that has been taught the gospel, that has been passed down from Abraham, and they all have the same beliefs. He brings this family, because it's just a family. They're not this big culture, this big people, right? He brings his family into Egypt. It is in Egypt that these people flourish, and they grow into this big population. And eventually things change, and Egypt begins to perceive Israel, these Israelites, this family that had come into Egypt, as an enemy. And when we think of the story of Moses, we always think of Egypt as the enemy to the Israelites. But were they an enemy to God? The concept of Egypt in this whole story in Exodus is such a fascinating one to me. And I'm going to be talking a lot about history in this video, so bear with me until I can pull the principles out so that we can apply it to our own lives. But it's really important to understand the history here so that we can more fully appreciate how God was placing everything perfectly in order for his people. So I want you to imagine that Joseph was never sold into Egypt by his brothers, right? He's thrown into the pit. The brothers are like, should we sell him? Should we kill him? What if dad finds out? They ultimately decide that they're not going to sell their brother. They pull him back out of the pit. They all go home and they're like, we were never going to sell you, right? And Joseph continues to grow and is continued to be taught by his father about the gospel, is continued to be prepared to become the leader of this family that all have these same beliefs. His brothers never have the experience of feeling remorse for selling their brother into slavery, right? They never go through the process of repentance. In fact, they just become more and more angry that their brother's going to be the leader. They get more annoyed with him. And eventually Joseph, their father, dies. Joseph ascends into his role as leader. He receives the birthright. He does his best to take that birthright and take care of this growing family that's getting really big by this point, right? There's 12 brothers. Who knows how many daughters there are, and there's lots more children coming in, right? I can't say this for sure, but I would imagine that this family wouldn't have stayed together. They would have splintered. It was very common in that day for nomads, for these nomadic groups, to start breaking off, right? So once your tribe or your clan started to reach 50 to 100 people, it would start to splinter off, right? It didn't make sense to all stay together trying to travel and get to water resources, all these different things. So they started to splinter off. So not only was this normal for these groups to splinter off, but there was a lot of strife within Joseph's family. I can't imagine that the brothers would have just rolled over and been like, okay, yeah, you're the leader, I guess. I would imagine that they would have taken their families and splintered off. There would have never been a chance for this family to become the house of Israel, to become the Israelites, to flourish, to populate, to stay together, and become the Israelites that we traditionally know as God's people. Now, it's really interesting. Joseph was sold into Egypt, as we know. And during the time that Joseph was sold into Egypt, Egypt was under a foreign occupation. So there was a group of people called the Hyksos. There's a couple different pronunciations of that word as I was trying to look up the pronunciation. So the Hyksos, they are not Egyptians, but they were ruling over the Egyptians at the time. The Hyksos had Semitic blood, which meant they had the same blood, right, as the house of Israel. They had Hebrew blood, is basically what I'm trying to say. And they were ruling over Egypt at the time that Joseph came in. So it really kind of made sense that Joseph rose to stand next to this Semitic Pharaoh, right? It made sense that that there was this Israelite who was able to rise in the courts of Egypt because they were being ruled by people who are similar to them. So here is a verse that talks a little bit about it. Joseph has brought his family in, and this is what begins to happen. So Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, and this is actually after Joseph dies, but he's brought his family into Egypt. And it says, "And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them." So there's this separate group of people. They're living in Egypt. There's Egyptians, there's Hebrews. Joseph became the ruler. Well, things change. The Hyksos are overthrown, and once again, there's an Egyptian pharaoh ruling over Egypt, and this Egyptian pharaoh knew not Joseph. And Egypt didn't like being ruled over by this foreign occupation, by this Semitic pharaoh. So it kind of makes sense that this Egyptian pharaoh would be wary of this growing population of Israelites who had Semitic blood staying in Egypt, right? It wasn't just some random group that happened to kind of be forming in with Egypt. They had some of the same blood as these rulers that had taken over Egypt for a while. So it makes sense why this pharaoh was kind of nervous about these Israelites living in Egypt. And because he was so nervous about it, he actually turns them into slaves, makes their lives really difficult, trying to cut off some of their power, to the point where he wants to kill all the male children. Well, this is what happens. So this is Exodus chapter 1, and this is verse 12. It says, "But the more they afflicted them," so the more the Egyptians afflicted the Hebrews, "the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel." So even though the Israelites were going through this period of immense trial in which their burdens were very heavy, they continued to populate and grow and make Egypt afraid. I want you to imagine for a second that things played out differently. Once again, Egypt, let's say that this Egyptian pharaoh rises to power, and instead of seeing the Israelites as a threat, he sees them as separate from these Hyksos people that had been ruling over Egypt. And he chooses to welcome the Israelites and to bring them into the culture, right? Well, what exactly would have happened, right? The Israelites would have been very happy in Egypt. They are not off being nomads, fighting over water and limited resources, but they're living in this land of plenty. I imagine that they would have started to intermarry with the Egyptians and to adopt the Egyptian culture. And eventually, the Hebrew blood would have become so diluted and the Hebrew culture would have become so diluted that it really wouldn't have been Hebrews and Egyptians, would have been Egyptians. And this group of people was just kind of swallowed into Egypt. There would have been no house of Israel. But because this Egyptian Pharaoh was afraid specifically of Semitic blood, and because he turned them into slaves, this populous group of people were able to keep their identity. They became, instead of this splintered family, they became this unified group of people who were separated from the Egyptians, because the Egyptians are like, you are Hebrews, we are Egyptian, we are separate from you, we do not intermarry with you, we are different people, right? They were able to continue to dwell in Egypt, where they were populating like crazy, but because the Egyptians turned them into enemies, they were able to keep their identity. In fact, it probably unified them as a people, because they were no longer part of Egypt. They were a separate culture because the Egyptians made it so. So it's really cool what happened, right? So when Egypt was not an enemy, the Egyptians were flourishing. They were populating, not the Egyptians, the Israelites were flourishing and populating. And then as Egypt becomes an enemy, they still are playing into God's plan, right? Because Israel is able to grow into its identity. Even after Egypt becomes an enemy to the Israelites, Egypt remains a blessing, right? It was all part of God's plan. So I look at how the Lord used these huge groups of people, right? The Hyksos coming in that had Semitic blood, right? It could have been anyone that came in and occupied Egypt, but it was the Hyksos people that came in and occupied Egypt. Joseph rises to power. The Israelites flourish. The Hyksos are overthrown, so that, yeah, there's just so many moving parts, and the Lord was manipulating all of it and controlling all of it, and he was at the steering wheel behind all of this. He knew all of the details that were going on at this time. When I think about all these moving parts, it really stresses me out, actually, because it just stresses me out. But why is this so important to understand? Why is it so important to look at the history that's going on right now and to fully appreciate it? Well, I've noticed that sometimes in our lives, it helps to label different seasons in our lives. So I want to share a little bit of our story, of me and my family's story, but the principles as I share it can apply to all of us. So when my husband and I were living in Utah with our family, we were there, I think 5 or 6 years. I can't really remember. We were there multiple years. And we were flourishing there. We were doing really, really well. We loved our home. And my husband had a decent job and was doing well. And we had incredible friends. We were surrounded by a wonderful ward. We were doing really well in Utah for a long time. Well, one by one, problems kind of started to step in until everything fell apart at once. My husband lost his job. All of these terrible, terrible things happened. And I look at that part where we were flourishing, and I label it as Egypt under Joseph, right? So the Israelites are friends with Egypt, and they're flourishing, doing really, really well. Well, then everything starts to fall apart, and there were a couple of avenues that we were trying to take to remain in Utah. My husband really, really wanted to stay there. He loved Utah. And there were lots of routes with potential, like things that we could do in order to stay in Utah. But it just seemed like we kept hitting closed door after closed door after closed door. Nothing was panning out for us in a lot of aspects, right? Not just financially, but in a lot of aspects, we just felt like doors kept getting closed. And I remember sitting in the car with my husband as another door got closed and as another awesome opportunity didn't pan out. And I remember kind of talking to him and being like, I wonder if the Lord is kind of manipulating this around us so that when it's time to leave, we're going to be ready to leave. And so I label this portion of our life Egypt under Egyptian Pharaoh, not with Joseph, right? So the Israelites are running into all of these problems, and they're being prepared to the point where they're going to be ready to leave Egypt because they're not happy there anymore. And even looking ahead into the future chapters, I look at how the Israelites, even after they escaped slavery, they're still wandering in the wilderness for a long time. And living in a hotel feels a lot like wandering. But I look back at how well we were doing in Utah and how things changed so rapidly, and I see the Lord's hand in it. My husband and I feel so strongly that we're exactly where we need to be. Even utilizing people who weren't doing what was right? The Lord is placing people exactly where they needed to be so that the right doors closed for us so that we could leave at the time that we needed to leave. And as I look forward, I also know that the Lord's hand is going to be continuing to lead us, even though we have no idea what we're doing. And we really, I don't know, there's just not a lot of avenues for us to take right now. And there's so many unknowns that it's hard for us to make decisions. We are wandering in the wilderness, but as I look forward, as I look at the story of the Israelites, I know that the Lord is going to be leading us just like he led his people. Perhaps you are in a stage of your life where you're flourishing, where you are Egypt under Joseph. Perhaps you are in a stage in your life where you feel like things just aren't coming together. It just seems like everything's clashing against each other. Nothing is falling into place. Everything is working against you. Or perhaps you're in this wandering phase where you're unsure and you're just waiting for the Lord to tell you and to show you where you're supposed to end up, right? Whatever phase of life that you're in right now, learn this from the Israelites, that God is preparing everything perfectly for you. He is setting everything up, right? He is setting up every person perfectly, right? He brought in the Hyksos. He brought in the hard-hearted Pharaoh. He brought in Joseph. He is setting people exactly where they need to be. He is setting up every watering hole, resting place, trial. As you wander through the wilderness, he is setting up everything perfectly for you so that you end up exactly where you're supposed to be. Not only did he use Joseph, this young boy who loved the Lord, who had such integrity, but he utilized the hard-hearted Pharaoh. We look at him as the enemy. Oh my gosh, he's the bad guy. But the Lord was using him, right? Because this Pharaoh decided to be hard-hearted and was so angry, the Israelites were able to see incredible miracles done by Moses and were able to trust Moses enough to follow him into the wilderness. Just like the Lord knew all of the different governments that were controlling the world then, he knows all of the big governments that are controlling the world today. And this seems especially poignant as we look at what's happening in Ukraine with Russia. It's happening with all sorts of countries around the world, right? Ukraine isn't the first refugee crisis to be happening. The Lord is aware of it all. And so that almost makes it, for some people that might make the Lord seem cruel, right? Like, if he can manipulate all of these governments perfectly, why isn't he bringing about peace? The Lord has set bounds for the extent to which he's willing to interfere in the agency of people here on earth. And he does that very purposely. He does that because if he interferes too much, he's going to completely destroy the plan of salvation, right? He has to let people make their evil decisions so that they can bring their own fate upon them. He needs us to walk by faith and to grow. There's reasons that he does not always interfere and bring about happy, peaceful times for his people all the time. And there's a lot of pain associated with that, right? He doesn't stop all the evil people in the world, and there are good people who suffer. However, I can promise you this. I promise you that every trial you're running into can be a stepping stone closer to him, because it is with him where you're going to find peace. It's not going to be when the world is doing everything right. It's going to be as you step closer to Christ, you are going to find the peace that you're looking for in every single bad thing that's occurring. All of the terrible, evil deeds occurring, No matter what forces are working against you or around you, all of these things can become stepping stones towards Christ, who is going to bring you that peace that you're looking for. Even death, which by many people in this world is seen as the ultimate, I don't want anything to do with death, right? Even death becomes grace with Jesus Christ. I know that nothing in the world, nothing evil and terrible can permanently take away your peace or your happiness because of Jesus Christ. I know that Jesus Christ has the capacity to fulfill all of his promises to those who draw close to him. His promises of delivering peace, of delivering healing. We don't know when all of these things are going to occur. We don't know when we're going to make it to the promised land. The Israelites wandered for 40 years. We don't know when these good things are going to come, but I promise that the Lord has the capacity to deliver, and he will deliver his promises at the perfect time for you. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.